What's behind Russia's withdrawal from Syria? Vladimir Putin has announced that the Russian military will begin to pull out from the country. But why now? What does this mean for Bashar al-Assad? And how will it impact the talks to reach a political deal? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. When Russia abruptly intervened with airstrikes in Syria last September, it was seen as a way of shifting the balance of power back in favour of President Bashar al-Assad. 6 months on, and Moscow clearly believes it's done enough to bolster the Assad government. It's begun withdrawing troops and planes from Syria. But Russia isn't completely giving up its military foothold in the country. It will keep the airbase it installed so rapidly last year near Latakia on Syria's Mediterranean coast. And its navy will continue to use the port of Tartus further south. For some, the timing of this partial pullout represents Russia positioning itself for tough negotiations about Syria's future. It was announced on the first day of peace talks when they resumed in Geneva. President Vladimir Putin says the military intervention has largely achieved its objectives.
Thanks to the participation of the Russian military grouping, the Syrian armed forces and patriotic forces in Syria have been able to achieve a fundamental turnaround in the fight against international terrorism and to take the initiative on almost all fronts to create conditions, as I said already, for the start of a peace process.
Well, Russia has been accused of using the presence of ISIL fighters as a cover to attack more moderate Syrian rebel forces opposed to Bashar al-Assad, turning the tide of the war definitively in his favour. Western leaders, who were taken by surprise, immediately condemned the intervention. But on Monday, Russia's defence ministry talked about the campaign's successes. It said Russian air raids had helped liberate 400 separate populated areas across some 10,000 square kilometres and had helped the Syrian government recapture gas and oil fields near Palmyra. The Russians also say airstrikes were important in blocking what they describe as terrorist supply routes to Turkey. But Moscow has also been accused of indiscriminate attacks that killed thousands of people. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that in addition to more than 2,000 fighters killed, the bombing campaign killed more than 1,700 civilians. Let's get the thoughts of our guests now. And joining us from Moscow, Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. In Paris, Janine di Giovanni, Middle East editor at Newsweek and author of the book The Morning They Came for Us, Dispatches from Syria. And in London, Shashank Joshi, senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome, all of you. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. Mark, can we start with getting your thoughts on why Russia is withdrawing now?
Well, there's never one reason for these events. I think we can point briefly to four major reasons. One, Russia is making a major goodwill and diplomatic gesture. It is serious about pushing forward a political transition with the restart of the Geneva peace talks. And it is making a gesture and putting the onus now on the U.S. And its Turkey, Saudi, and Qatari allies to rein in their proxies on the ground and commit to a real peace process. Second, I think we can say that Russia, in doing this, is also attempting to impose a reality check on the Syrian president about how much and how long they're willing to commit, and that he should be willing to make some compromises in negotiations as well. Third, I think that Russia has recently reassessed their strategic objectives in Syria with this declaration of mission accomplished, which could possibly be read as a George W. Bush moment. This is, I believe, in light that Russia believes that a escalation could be pending, and this is the fourth reason. That Turkey and Saudi Arabia have both been making a lot of noise about invading Syria. U.S. military brass and neocon think tanks have moved from calling for regime change in Syria to partition of the country. And we have seen movements of Saudi planes to Turkey. We have recently discovered that a U.S. Stinger missile was discovered a few days ago to have been used to shoot down a Syrian MiG. Russia intervened 6 months ago to prevent a direct military intervention, the creation of a safe zone that would lead to Libya-style regime change. And I believe they're doing it, ironically, once again, figuring that their signal of de-escalation may prevent a wider regional conflagration.
OK. Shashank, can I put that to you? To what extent do you agree with Mark that A, this is a goodwill gesture from Russia, B, that they might be doing it to avoid a possible escalation in Syria?
I think the point about escalation may be correct, although it's impossible to say for sure. I think I would preface everything I say with the point that what we're seeing isn't a withdrawal, it's a drawdown, to use language we've seen used in Afghanistan. Of course, the Russian bases will remain, the S-400 will remain. We've seen the Deputy Defense Minister say that airstrikes will continue. So I think that word that was just used, de-escalation, is the right word. I think that's what it is. It's a drawdown. I think I would add another reason, which is to say Russia has accomplished many of its objectives. It has battered rebel groups in the north. It's severed many of the supply lines from the north as well. And it's made sure that the regime is in a more solid position than it was a year ago. And that's, of course, a major achievement on the part of both Damascus and Moscow. The regime is no longer at risk of imminently falling, as it may have been at parts of last year, prompting Russian intervention. And so the important thing to remember is Russia can also re-enter the conflict if it so needs. If it looks like the gains won over the past 3 or 4 months are being jeopardized, the infrastructure will all remain in place to ramp back up. But having said that, I do think that this can result in a move towards putting pressure on Assad towards serious engagement with the talks. And so, yes, I think there may be a positive impact from this on the political process.
I certainly want to look at the political process and the impact this is going to have on Assad a little later in the discussion. First of all, though, I'd like to draw in Janine here, because, Janine, I know that you've spent time in Syria and you speak to many people there. What effect has the Russian military campaign had on Syrians?
Well, first, listening to my fellow panelists, I'd like to say or try to quote what the HNC spokesman said yesterday, which I think basically sums it up completely. He said, "Who knows what goes on in Putin's mind? The point is, it's not his country. Please go." And I think that we can speculate about what Putin's motives are, but essentially for me, what stands out the most is that since the Russian bombardment began on the 30th of September, 1,700 civilians have died. So when he says mission accomplished, I'd like to know what that means, because ISIS recruitment hasn't gone down. He has not captured Raqqa. There are still some of the main top players of ISIS are still in effect working. So I would like to see what actually mission accomplished means, although I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of that.
Okay, well, I'll return to you in just a second, Janine. Let's let Mark just answer that first of all, then we'll return again to you to get an idea of the impact on Syrians. Mark, one of the stated aims of Putin was to defeat ISIL in Syria. That clearly hasn't happened, as Janine's just said. Raqqa is still very firmly in the grip. So what was the main objective there?
I actually agree with that assessment. I think even as much as a month ago, the Russian foreign minister was saying that Russia would not draw down its forces until both ISIS and al-Qaeda and its various sundry allies and affiliates, which include almost the entirety of the so-called rebel spectrum, the proxies across the field in Syria, they still control perhaps up to 70% of Syrian territory. And while they have been severely severely deteriorated, they have not been defeated. Syria still doesn't control its own borders. Turkey and Jordan continue to run CIA rat lines, running supplies, arms, and funds to the essential 31 flavors of jihad that populate the militant battlefield. Major population centers remain in the hands of Al-Qaeda in Idlib or Raqqa. I think that Russia's objectives have been downscaled principally to prevent a Turkish and Saudi invasion backed by the United States, with probably the intention not of direct regime change anymore, but creating a Salafist principality to replace the Islamic State in East Syria, a Salafistan that would house the militants from this sectarian conflict.
Okay, let's give the microphone back to Janine then to respond, and also to bring in the impact that all this has had on the Syrian civilians.
I think we need to, talk more about what has happened to the Syrian people rather than all this military language. Since the strikes, people were more terrified of the Russian bombs than they were of Assad's planes, and I think this says a lot. Speaking to the White Helmets, who of course are the heroic rescue workers, who are civilians that go into the buildings, pull out the children, the women, the wounded. What they feared were the Russian planes, because they do basically a double tap. They put one bomb in, and when the rescue workers go in to pull out the bodies, they then send in another one. Having been myself under Russian bombardment in Chechnya during the fall of Grozny, I know how brutal the Russian Air Force is and how they do not consider human lives and civilians. So I think on the ground now there will be great relief. Also the fact that the humanitarian aid, the choking of it, that the airstrikes, as a result of the airstrikes, they were hitting corridors, that people were fleeing, the amount of refugees since the Russian airstrikes started, we need to consider all that. So I think actually for on-the-ground purposes, this is going to be a respite. We don't know what's going to happen next or what Putin will do next, because I do feel that now that he thinks he's got a foot in Syria, which is important to him, a foot in the Middle East, I'm not sure he's going to retreat so easily. I agree with what Mark said, that this is just a drawback, a partial withdrawal. And I think that now he's tasted some kind of power in Syria, he's going to be very reluctant to give it up. But for the Syrian people themselves, or rather the people that have been under those hideous bombardments, this is going to be a relief for the moment. Now we need to get humanitarian aid in there. We need to unblock the sieges. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Janine, were people feeling in Syria that they were being deliberately targeted by these Russian strikes? We hear these reports of hospitals being targeted and schools and civilian targets.
Well, they did, and the White Helmets told me that they also targeted their centers. And that they did do these double taps, as they call them. They would hit, and when the rescue workers went in, they would strike again, leaving them with a 40% casualty rate. These are civilians that volunteer, the White Helmets they're called, to go in and rescue people. And they're from the community, so it's a very grassroots organization. But I think that people I speak to in Aleppo and other parts of Syria during the Russian strikes were terrified. It made their life unbearable. And you have to remember, I lived through the siege of Sarajevo, which was 3 years. This is the 5th year. It's 5 years today. Do you have any idea what it's like to live without water, without electricity, with bombs that drive you to the point of madness? And I remember being in Grozny and people warning me, the Russian planes will drive you to the point of madness. And this is what people in Aleppo, in Idlib, in other cities have had to endure. It's been unbearable. So I think that sorry?
No, go on, it's okay.
You know, this is, for the people today, a small victory. Whether or not it has any effect on the peace process, we need to follow that closely. And we also need to see if Putin is going to stick to his word. if he will bring the planes back, the strikes back. I think that, you know, it is very important, again, to remember who is he targeting and why. You know, was he really after ISIS? Was this really about terrorism on Russian soil?
Okay.
Or was it about helping Assad pursue a policy of scorched earth?
Let's bring in Shashank. That question, let's look at that and examine it. Who was Russia targeting?
I think we've been very clear about this. ISIS represented a minority of Russian targets. Most of their targets were other rebels. Yes, there were very large numbers of Nusra, Al-Qaeda fighters and other Al-Qaeda affiliated fighters. And then, of course, there were many others who were fighting in and around the same area. The debate as to whether the opposition is primarily allied to Al-Qaeda or is primarily independent or mainstream is a debate we're not going to settle here. It's one that divides supporters of Russia and Assad on the one hand and supporters of the rebellion on the other hand. What's very, very clear, though, is that they have stabilized the regime's position and that they have really hit those supply lines very, very hard north of Aleppo. The question really is, how sustainable is that going to be with a drawdown in Russian air power, particularly if we also see, as some have suggested, a reduction in the number of Iranian troops on the ground? Because, of course, the Syrian army itself is a relatively weak force that has relied greatly upon Iran-backed militias and Russian air power to make the gains it has in the last several months. But to me, I would say there's no doubt ISIS represents a small minority of Russian targets. It's very telling for me that Russia has declared its objectives mostly complete this week, but the US-led coalition continues to bombard ISIS on an ongoing basis and will do so for a long time to come, because its priority is, of course, ISIS in the east and north of the country.
Mark, as we've established, this is a partial withdrawal, a de-escalation, it's even being called. Russia is keeping an airbase in Latakia. It's also got a naval facility. If Assad does start once again losing ground, how long do you think before Russia steps back in?
Well, this is the real question, because we have already heard from Saudi Arabia that they will not base their decision whether to invade in support of their proxy jihadists on the ground in Syria on whether Russia withdraws partially or not. We have already heard Al-Qaeda, that is Jabhat al-Nusra, which, as our other guests have intimated, are allied almost across the Webbel field, including with the CIA proxy Free Syrian Army. They use lots of euphemisms: in close proximity, marbling, standing next to. But let's be honest. When I served in the U.S. military, Al-Qaeda was the enemy. And now we live in a very dark place where Al-Qaeda has become the ally of our proxies. So this is where Russia is going with this. We have two Security Council resolutions that say that not only ISIS should be eradicated, but Al-Qaeda and all of its allies on the ground.
Al-Qaeda is an ally of our proxies.
No, could I just make the point, just to be very clear, Saudi Arabia has, of course, Saudi Arabia has suggested it may send troops to Syria, but it has also said very clearly it would only do so with alongside the United States. And increasingly, there is no sign whatsoever that this administration would be willing to undertake any such move. So I don't entirely deny that Russia may be affected by the prospect of escalation on the part of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, but I think the idea of a Saudi invasion of Syria is absurd. They've made very, very clear they would only send troops with the United States, and I think we all know that isn't going to happen.
Let's look at the relationship between Putin and Assad. Russia said that Assad is on board with this withdrawal, but I can't imagine that Assad's too happy about this. What do you think's gone on there behind the scenes?
I think that Russia actually had a very dim opinion of President Assad going into this. They saw him as somewhat weak, someone who was trying to approach the West and neoliberalize his country, as it were. There was a lot of talk of reforms. Assad just a few years ago was the darling of the West, touring Western capitals. They see his weakness, his inability to govern. He was never supposed to. It was supposed to be his elder brother who died. But I think that Russia has reassessed somewhat in the light that he has managed, in spite of, a proxy war conducted, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars by the U.S., the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the European Union, Turkey, to overthrow his country. We've been arming, funding, training, and literally paying the salaries, American taxpayers, paying the salaries of Islamist proxies trying to overthrow the Syrian government for 5 years. But that said, Russia has a very pragmatic foreign policy. And while it will not accept another Western-backed regime change in the Middle East, it realizes that it has to make realistic compromises. And it has committed itself that the Syrian president will face elections. But I think President Putin has indicated that actually the majority of the Syrian people, we know that 70% of the Syrian population still lives protected in Syrian government-controlled areas.
Mark, I'm just going to pick up on that point and throw it over to Janine, because even if Putin does say that Assad's going to face elections, it's certainly not what the Syrian government is saying. So how much leverage, Janine, do you think Putin has over Assad?
I have to say I'm very frustrated listening to Mark because it has such a disconnect from what's really happening on the ground.
Likewise. I think we are in complete agreement with assessment of each other.
Do you work inside Syria, Mark? Do you go inside Syria and work there? Because I do. And I speak to Syrian people.
No, I have been a member of the U.S. military, though, and I know what the U.S. military is doing in Syria.
Okay, well, Mark,
you don't speak for the Christians of Syria. You don't speak for the Kurds, the Alawites, the Shia, the Druze.
Mark, we'll let Janine.
You don't speak for the Syrian minority.
I feel like I'm on Fox News right now. Okay, I really feel like I'm on Fox News right now. But can we just back up and talk about the war in how it's affecting the Syrian people? I've reported nearly 20 wars, and I feel like this is probably the most cynical. Both. Mark, both. Do you speak to the opposition?
Both.
You call them. You say that you lump all people who live in. Okay, can I continue? This is one of the most cynical wars that I've ever reported, because I feel that everyone, all the proxy countries, have absolutely no regard for the people on both sides, rather than pursue their own political interests. So in a sense, whether or not you're living in Damascus or Douma or Homs or Idlib or Aleppo, everyone has suffered. I mean, today is the 5th anniversary. More than, they say 250,000, I think it's more closer to 300,000 dead. 4 million refugees, 9 million displaced. I mean, we know these figures, but this is a horrific war. And it's come at the cost of what the Russians want, what the Iranians want, what the Americans want, what the Saudis want, what Qatar wants, without really taking into consideration what the Syrian people want. Now, the peace talks, again, there's a real disconnect between diplomacy and what's happening in Geneva, what happened in Munich, than what is actually happening on the ground.
Okay.
Even the representation, okay, the HNC is more representative than before, but it still is not really getting the consensus of the Syrian people.
Janine,
so
I just want to get the last word into Shashank there. You brought up the Geneva talks. We need to talk a little bit about that. Shashank, 1 minute. This announcement came on the opening day of those talks. How's it shifting momentum there?
I think at the end of the day, it will counteract some of the very confident pronouncements made by Assad and his foreign minister over the past several weeks that they are confident in retaking the entire country, that there will be no questions over the future of Assad. So the drawdown in Russian forces, even if it's reversible, even if it's minimal, does still send a message to Assad that he still needs to look at that process and engage with it and take it somewhat seriously.
Okay.
But having said that, I think Russia is concerned about initiating an uncontrollable political transition where it loses control of the process, and I am not sure they will be willing to let that happen.
Okay,
so
and
I
there
think
we're
we
going
will
to have
proceed
to leave
incrementally
it.
and
Shashank,
cautiously.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much to all our guests for joining us here today. Mark Sleboda, Janine di Giovanni and Shashank Joshi. Thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.